right, everyone. Maybe we can at least start with the preliminaries. Welcome to everybody who's here in person and also watching online. Thanks for being with us here today. My name is David Buckley. For those of you who don't know, I'm the director of the Center for Asian Democracy here at the University of Louisville. And I'm also the Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion here at U of L. We're here today for an event that's part of CAD's focus on bringing in academic experts from outside to address crucial topics facing democracy across the region of Asia. A major theme across South Asia, as we'll hear today, but really across different parts of the continent, is a growth in religious nationalism across the continent in very diverse areas, and the impact of religious nationalist movements on democracy and the future of democracy and rights in the region. We're very fortunate today to have one of the world's experts on that topic in the South Asian context to talk about the growth of religious nationalism in different forms in India and Sri Lanka, two of the longest standing democracies in the entire region, actually, but democracies that, like many of our democracies, face challenges today. So we're so glad to have Professor Neil DeVotta here with us to discuss these topics. I'll just briefly introduce him and then turn things over. Professor DeVotta is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University. His research includes South Asian security and politics, ethnicity and nationalism, ethnic conflict resolution, and democratic transitions and consolidation, and maybe these days deconsolidation. We have to update our bios these days. He is the author, probably most prominently, of a wonderful book called Blowback, Linguistic Nationalism, Institutional Decay, and Ethnic Conflict in Sri Lanka. And he's author and editor of several books related to politics in South Asia, including India and Sri Lanka, with articles appearing in leading journals like the Journal of Democracy, Pacific Affairs, and others. He also writes routinely for kind of policy-oriented audiences, so for especially students who have an interest in how academics interact with policy environments. Those would be great questions to ask, and you can also see his writings on those topics. So we'll have about 40 minutes for a presentation from Professor DeVotta, and then we'll turn things over for questions. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, David.
Very glad.
So my thanks to David for having me come here. It's always good to visit the new campus, and this is certainly my first visit to Louisville and this campus. My thanks to the Center for Asian Democracy and the Political Science Department and all of you for coming. I have to correct David on one comment that he made, and that was calling me an expert. Because I firmly believe that there are no experts when it comes to South Asia, especially India. There are two types of people who think that they're experts: those who are ignorant and those who are arrogant. And if you're an academic, you probably run into people like that. But it's the complications associated with this region. The cross-cutting cleavages are just so enormous that it's mind-boggling. So, I actually approached my study of South Asia, even Sri Lanka, which I know quite a bit about, as a student, less a student and more an expert. And so I cringe, but I appreciate the confidence here. So my talk is on religion and nationalism in India and Sri Lanka. And I try to keep it a bit simple because I knew we'd have students here. This, is the region. We have 8 countries that constitute South Asia. Sri Lanka is one of the smaller countries. India is the largest, both in terms of population, of the world's largest country from a population standpoint, and also territorially, the 7th largest, I think, in the world territorially, but the largest in South Asia. And these two countries are experiencing what we could refer to as a democracy paradox, in that they are very good at holding elections. People vote in very high numbers. People take elections very seriously. And at the same time, we have an issue when it comes to governance, enormous malgovernance. And part of this is connected to the way religion has been weaponized. So religious nationalism, undermining secularism, undermining pluralism, two things that are directly connected to especially liberal democracy. Now, this backsliding that we've seen over the last 15 or 16 years when it comes to democracy, is not new to the region. It's something we're seeing all over the world, including this country, unfortunately. And if you track the Freedom House numbers that come out every year, you see this, all over the world, really. So much so that India is now branded partly free by Freedom House, and was last year, or maybe this year, branded an electoral autocracy. So we can think of these countries as electoral democracies, as opposed to liberal democracies. But India was branded an electoral autocracy by Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM, which is also another very prominent, kind of association, organization that tracks democracy worldwide. I thought I'd say a bit about secularism in India very quickly because, India is considered a secular country. It didn't, in its constitution, originally start out by identifying as secular, but then in 1976, using the 42nd Amendment, it branded itself a socialist secular republic. So it's officially a secular, a democracy. And there were huge debates as to whether to call India secular, when the constitution was put together soon after independence or during independence. The constitution in India came into being in 1950, so they spent about 2.5 years going through incredibly rigorous debates, all of which have been kind of preserved. And so we have kind of two notions of, secularism in India. We have Nehru's notion of secularism, which is in line with what we see here in the US with the Establishment Clause. It's this idea that you focus on public law and you focus on the rights of citizens. Nehru also was kind of very, very strongly believed that as Indians, got more educated, you have to remember, and some of you young people will find this really stunning, but at the time of independence in 1947, only about 16% of Indians were literate. Only about 16% of people could read and write, and that means that over 90% of women couldn't, read or write. And it still was committed to this idea of the one person, one vote. And so Nehru's thinking was that as India, people got more educated, as people learned, more about the sciences, that they would be more rational, and that you'd see religion vitiate, weaken within the kind of Indian social fabric. Gandhi's notion of secularism is different because he sees India as being kind of across the board among all communities, being very much a religious society, that you can't separate religion from the way society is governed, and the sense that we should treat all religions equally is something that Gandhi espoused. And so it's more supportive of groups in a sense. Okay. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, the constitution, I think I have a slide here. The constitution of Sri Lanka basically says that, not the original constitution, but the one that was put together in 72, and then the one that was put together in 78, reiterates this idea that Buddhism is to be provided a special place within Sri Lanka. So in that sense, you cannot really think of it as secular. Now, in the Indian case, secularism has clashed with Hindutva. Okay, so Hindutva can be defined in different ways, but one way of looking at it is to think of it as this idea that it doesn't matter what your religion is when it comes to India, that everybody, irrespective of what religion they subscribe to, must embrace a Hindu ethos and shouldn't do anything that undermines India's fundamentally Hindu character. Okay, and so for those who advocate Hindutva, secular oftentimes gets kind of bandied about as secular, meaning that those who promote secularism are really sick. Okay, now I'm going back and forth. Instead of having a section on Sri Lanka and a section on India, I thought we'll just try to combine this and see how it works. In the Sri Lankan case, we have about 70% of the population that are Buddhists, and 75% are Sinhalese, and the vast majority of Sinhalese are Buddhists. And so we have religion and language being fused in a very powerful way. So when we talk about Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism, we're talking about not just Buddhism, but we're also talking about the Sinhala language. Now, it's helpful to differentiate between kind of ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. In that, when we talk about ethnic nationalism, what we're talking about is a nationalism that tends to typically favor a dominant group, typically a majority group. But I think occasionally you may find a group that controls the levels of power that are not in a majority. And so if you think in terms of a dominant group, where their myths and their religion and language and kinship are privileged, then we can think of that as ethnic nationalism, which gets juxtaposed with civic nationalism, where loyalty resides in political ideas and a constitution, which is ultimately the most important institution in a country. And so what we have in the case of India and Sri Lanka, what we can refer to as ethno-religious nationalisms. Okay, and so nationalism here is rooted in ethnic identity. It's rooted in religion, using typically texts, beliefs, and practices. Okay, and I'll say something about religious texts very quickly. So, in terms of facets of religious nationalism, religion gets used as a primary marker. So, if you think of an ethnic group, there are a number of things that contributes to the group's identity. It could be language, it could be region, it could be certain beliefs and myths. But when we talk about religious nationalism, it is religion that operates as the primary marker. And these markers are switchable. So if you take Bangladesh, for instance, those of you who may know something about Bangladesh, Bangladesh embraced a religious identity. It was called East Pakistan, and it joined with West Pakistan, which is today's Pakistan, during partition. So it used the Bengali language as a secondary marker, embraced religion as a primary marker to join with West Pakistan to separate from India in 1947. And then in 1971, as part of the independence movement, it again switched identities. It made language the primary marker and downgraded religion as a secondary marker. So these depending on the agenda of the nationalist, identities can be switchable. But when we talk about religious nationalism, your focus becomes religion as a primary identity marker. And it then gets used to legitimize a privileged status for the dominant community. It becomes weaponized to, for political gain. And typically, those who are part of the religion get treated as what we call Bhumi Putra. Bhumi means land in Sanskrit, and Putra means son. So they become sons of the soil, whereas others are not. Others are interlopers, they're outsiders. Okay, and so religion has a way of taking on kind of a fundamentalist character when it comes to religious nationalism. And I wanted to note this because when you read about religious nationalism in India, it's very common to see the term Hindu fundamentalism. Now, Hindu fundamentalism is a misnomer. It's a misnomer because there are no fundamentals in Hinduism. You can talk about Jewish fundamentalism because you've got the Torah. You can talk about Christian fundamentalism because you got the New Testament. You can even talk about Theravada Buddhist fundamentalism because there is a Buddhist text called the Tripitaka, written solely in Pali. It's 3 sections of a book with Buddha's discourses, his sermons, the law pertaining to the monks, and then you have these philosophical writings. And so, but in its totality, it only exists in Pali, and the Theravada monks. There are 2 main strands of Buddhism, not to get sidelined here. There's the Mahayana version of Buddhism and the Theravada version. Theravada is more conservative. And so and it's mainly the scriptures are in Pali. And so you can talk about a fundamentalist text because you have the text. Whereas in Hinduism, you have many texts, many religions. You could be an atheist and still be perfect Hindu. I mean, they would not think of you as not being Hindu. If you thought of yourself as a Hindu and you're an atheist, you'll be considered a Hindu. You could be a monotheist and believe in just one God, whether it's Ram or Krishna or Vishnu. Or you could be a polytheist, and you only have about 33 million gods to pick from if you're a polytheist. So, hey, so talking about Hindu fundamentalism, the term alone is a misnomer, but Hindu nationalism, I think, is a more accurate term. And then you have the ideologies associated with the religious nationalism. Now, in the Hindutva case, we have two kind of terms. There's a lot that you can touch on when it comes to Hindutva, but the term, there's a book, a little tract that was written by a man called Savarkar, who is kind of a very leading figure in the Hindutva movement. He was, this book came out, I think, around 1923, 24, thereabouts. Savarkar was also charged in Gandhi's murder as a co-conspirator, but then for lack of evidence was let go. But he seems to have had a hand in Gandhi's murder because he saw Gandhi as someone who was committed to secularism and who was responsible for India's partition, whereas these folks believe in kind of a greater India, like a Eretz Israel, if you will. And there are some who are now clamoring for all of what used to be India historically, which would certainly include Pakistan and Bangladesh, to be part of a greater India. So you can see how this can become very dangerous going forward. But this notion of Pitri Bhumi and Punya Bhumi. Pitri means father, Bhumi means land, so fatherland, and Punya means holy, and Bhumi means land, so holy land. And it's this idea that only Hindus, now others have been added to it, like the Sikhs, you may have read about what happened with the assassination of a Sikh religious leader in Canada. And I can answer some questions on that if you have questions. But religions that originated in India, say the Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, which precedes Buddhism, and of course Hinduism, which is the oldest of all. Only these people who subscribe to these religions, only these people who are part of these religions can be considered both Pitri Bhumi and Punya Bhumi. These are people who would consider India not only to be their fatherland, but they would also consider India to be their holy land. Whereas others, like Muslims and Christians and Jews, there are very, very small Jewish communities, a few Zoroastrians who came from Iran many, many years ago called Parsis. But those are the other religious groups that exist in India. But the biggest groups that are not so-called quote-unquote native would be Muslims and Christians. They may consider India their fatherland if they were born there, but it would never be their holy land. Because the Catholics are going to look to Rome, the few Jews will look to Jerusalem, the Muslims will look to Mecca and Medina. Protestants, I don't know where they look to, maybe Louisville. Someplace in Kansas, but they certainly would look to India, right? So here we have, this, and so the ideologies then are rooted in this notion of Pitri Bhumi and Punya Bhumi in India. In Sri Lanka, what some of us have called Sinhalatva, which is an ideology similar to Hindutva. It's this idea of Sri Lanka being a Singha Deepa. Deepa means island, so it's the island of the Sinhalese people, and Dhamma Deepa. And Dhamma popularly referred to as religion or beliefs. And so it's Sri Lanka then becomes the island of the Sinhalese and the island where Buddha's religion, it's a repository for Buddha's religion. So it's a special place for Buddhists. So India becomes a special place for Hindus, and even though Buddhism did not originate in Sri Lanka, it's a place that Buddha chose for his religion to kind of be preserved and for it to spread from there. Now, what are the implications of nationalist ideologies? Okay, so in both cases, in both countries, the the rhetoric dictates that minorities live in these countries thanks to the sufferance of the majority community, and that they should not make undue demands on the part of the state that ought to represent the interests of the majority community. And therefore, minority domination, minority subjugation, sorry, majority domination and minority subjugation is perfectly justified. Okay, and I have a couple of quotes here dealing with this pertaining to Sri Lanka in a while. And then associated with this is the rhetoric that those who seek to kind of undermine majority dominance, those who talk about secularism and pluralism, and human rights, that these are basically traitors because these are concepts that are being used to undermine, the gains made by the majority community. These are demands get made using, this kind of language, which is basically Western influence language. Human rights are associated with, Western countries and Western NGOs, and then religious freedom, the freedom to convert and the like, gets associated with evangelical groups. And so all those who advocate for minority rights are doing this as part of some great conspiracy to undermine the gains made by majority communities in societies that were long dominated by colonial forces, right? I mean, you don't forget the colonial aspect here because these are countries. Sri Lanka spent 450 years under first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. Okay, and so that anti-colonial narrative gets fused into this whole discourse on religious nationalism, which can be very powerful, especially when it's the clergy articulating it. In Sri Lanka, it would be the monks, the Buddhist monks. And then I think the most dangerous thing with ideologies is that it justifies atrocities. People who know that their actions are unethical, immoral, evil, are able to justify those actions within the context of an ideology. And as I was putting this together, and I'm also thinking about this because I'm doing a couple of essays on religion and ideology for a couple of workshops. And I recently ran into something associated with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and who just saw some of the most horrendous stuff. I mean, he just didn't see people die, he saw people tortured in ways that I don't feel comfortable talking about. That's how bad it was. And he had to ask himself, what causes people to commit such evil? And I found it interesting that he basically came to the conclusion that these people were doing these things knowing that they were evil, but they still did it because of an ideology. The ideology allowed them. The ideology associated with the Soviet state allowed them to perpetrate these atrocities. And so that scares me because when you look at what's happened in these two countries against minority communities, and in India especially against the Muslim community, and the way in which those anti-minority activities have been ramped up in the last 9 years in India, but for a while in Sri Lanka, this may not be the end of the road because if the ideology thrives, then the violence against minorities will likewise thrive, right? And that comes at the expense of democracy, obviously. So here's a comment by a very prominent monk. He is seen as not just a monk, but as a scholar monk who wrote in English as well. In fact, one of the most prominent books coming out of the Sri Lankan monk in English was by Walpola Rahula. And he said, get this straight and quote me, Sri Lanka is a Buddhist singular country. Let no one make a mistake. 70% of the country consists of Buddhists and singular people. Also make this clear that Sri Lanka is the only Buddhist singular country in the world. If we don't live here, are the LTT, which was the group that waged a very violent terrorist campaign to create a separate country in Sri Lanka for the Tamil minority, are they asking us to jump into the sea, right? And he got angry with the former president of Sri Lanka because he called it a multinational and multi-religious state, and he insists, no, it is a Buddhist singular state. And this is another monk associated with a group called the Buddhist Power Force, which has links to the 969 movement in Burma that we were talking about before the talk. And he said, this is a single Buddhist country. Can you go to England or the US and say that they are a multi-religious country? Of course, there are other communities in those countries, but they are Christian countries. It's the same here. Other communities have been living here, but this is a single Buddhist country. You call a coconut plantation a coconut plantation. You don't identify it by the other small plants that have grown there. Okay, so the typical majoritarian attitude, which basically says, the others have got to cling to the wishes of the dominant majority community. Now, in the Indian case, Hindutva is mainly being propagated by a group called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the Association of National Volunteers. Was created in 1925. So look out for some very interesting things happening between now and the next 2 years, because 2025 would be the centenary of the creation of the RSS. And Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is not just a member of the RSS. He's what they call a pracharak. He was a fully committed volunteer. So in Modi's case, he was apparently married. Depending on who you read, he was only with his wife for 2 days or 2 weeks. The marriage was supposedly not consummated. He left, and he has never seen his wife again, who's still alive, I believe. And he went and basically dedicated his life to the RSS, and then got special permission from the RSS to join the BJP. Okay, so the BJP is an affiliate of the RSS. So the way to think about this, there are about 39 affiliates connected to the Hindutva movement. So you've got the RSS at the top. You can think of it as the umbrella. And under the RSS, you have these affiliates, all sorts of groups. The BJP is the political arm of the RSS. And then you have various other groups, and I noted a few here, but there are about 39 in total. And the RSS coordinates the activities, and I believe they have like monthly meetings among all these leaders. And they all subscribe to, they may have differences. So like, for example, a lawyers group may have differences with a women's group, which may have differences with an agricultural related group, right? But they all subscribe to the same ideology, Hindutva, and together they're called the Sangh Parivar, or a family of associations. Now, they have some major goals, and they want, for instance, to see a very homogenized Hinduism. Remember, I told you there are no fundamentals in Hinduism, that you can be an atheist, a polytheist, or a monotheist and still be a Hindu. What they want is kind of a homogenized Hinduism where everybody subscribes to some very specific kind of rules and beliefs. Okay, they want to standardize the Ramayana. So the beauty of Hinduism to me, and I'm not a Hindu, I was raised Catholic, but when I go to a Hindu temple, I find it fascinating because when you go to a Catholic mass, you know what's going to happen. You know every single utterance, right, that's going to happen in the next 30 minutes or 40 minutes. The only thing that would vary is the sermon, right? Otherwise, everything else from the first reading to the second reading has been decided by Rome, a few years in advance. When you go to a Hindu temple, it's very varied. You see all kinds of different styles of worship, the people doing different things. You wonder why they're doing what they're doing. So when you take the Ramayana, for instance, there are about 800 versions of the Ramayana. But they want to make the one version by this sage called Valmiki the only version. And the Ramayana and the god Ram in this story is connected to the whole Ayodhya issue where a mosque was destroyed. So I don't know how much you know, but Ayodhya wouldn't hurt for you to look it up. But there was this long-standing mosque that was built in honor of the very first Muslim emperor called Babur, the Mughal emperor, by one of his lieutenants. And that was basically completely destroyed in 1992 December. And they've been wanting to build a temple and that case just was languished in the courts, and finally the courts basically gave the right to the Hindus to build the temple. Modi went and laid the foundation stone amidst great fanfare, and the temple should now be opened in the next few months, and it's gonna certainly happen before May 2024, because May 2024 is the election. Okay, and so Modi will use that, it weaponize that whole event as part of his election campaign. So, so the Ramayana is connected to Ayodhya in that sense. They want a more congregational style of worship. Muslims worship every Friday. They look east. I think that Catholics go to church. Christians go to church every Sunday. It's very powerful to know that you have 1 billion people like you who are doing the same thing at the same time, more or less. And whereas in Hinduism, everybody does whatever they want, and so they want to have a more kind of congregational style of worship. The temple will get constructed before May. Article 370 has to do with Kashmir. That is also now done. Kashmir was its own state. So what you see in India, like you have seen in the US, is you have territories, first-class territories, that the next step, the logical step for them would be to become a state. So just like Alaska became a state, Hawaii became a state. And so India is very good at creating states. It's one of the few countries in the world that's very, very good at creating new states. When I was an undergraduate like you, there were 25 states in India. When I became a PhD student with Jasmine, there were 28 states. And then a few years ago, they added a 29th state in the south called Telangana. Now, Modi was the first person to take a state, that's Kashmir, and downgrade it to a territory. And then they end up splitting up the territories. So we have Kashmir, and now there are 2 territories. So that goes against the grain. But that also was connected to kind of repealing Article 370. And Kashmir is the only Muslim majority state in India. There are large communities of Muslims in certain states in India, but Kashmir is the only majority Muslim state in India. Not anymore, there is now a territory. Instituting a uniform civil code so that everybody has the same rules. So India has different rules for different communities when it comes to marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Muslims can kind of operate based on a Muslim code of law, and so they'd like to have a single uniform civil code. Taking all of Kashmir, well, good luck with that. Pakistan controls 1/3 of Kashmir. India controls 2/3 of Kashmir. They fought 3 wars over Kashmir. So both have nuclear weapons. So, you can see how this ends. Okay. Trying to get hold of all of Kashmir. Banning cow slaughter. Cow slaughter is banned in some states, maybe 10 or 11 states. Even where it's not banned, people are very sensitive to openly kind of, carrying out cow slaughter because it hurts the sensibilities of the majority community. But that again is something they'd like to see happen. Banning conversions. Okay. But banning conversions, those go just one way. Okay. Banning conversions from, say, Hindu to, Muslim, being Muslim or Christian. But Hindus and Muslims becoming Hindu, Christians and Muslims becoming Hindus, perfectly fine. Okay. And some states have anti-conversion laws as part of their statutes. And then rewriting Indian history and Hindu history. And this is a project that is well on its way. So it's not just Hindu history. So you have textbooks now where the Mughals are hardly mentioned, where Gandhi is like a footnote, where Nehru, who was India's first prime minister and in many ways a major architect of making India a democracy, just kind of left on the sidelines, and where you have people who never participated. Most of these people who are part of the Hindutva movement never participated in the Indian independence movement. Gandhi spent about 10, 11, 12 years, I think, in prison. Nehru spent over 10 years in prison. And all the Hindutvadis who are clamoring for a different kind of India, most of their leaders at the time of independence did not spend any time in prison. And so you have this project is now well on its way. So I will, in the interest of time, not say much about the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, just to say that, well, I mean, there's an attempt now to have all Indians prove they have to have a piece of paper that says that they were born in India. And about 40% of Muslims don't have that paper. But there are also millions and millions of Hindus who don't have that paper. But because of this Citizenship Amendment Act that was passed just before COVID hit, if you can claim that you are a minority who belongs to the Hindu community, the Buddhist community, the Christian community, or you're a Jain or a Sikh or a Parsi, if you can say that you're one of these people who came into India from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, then under the Citizenship Amendment Act, you would become an Indian citizen. You'll get that piece of paper to say that you're an Indian citizen. Well, Hindus in India with no paper can always revert to this and say that, we are refugees. Whereas if you're a Muslim, you're not given that opportunity. And also you can see that some countries are left out here. Sri Lanka is left out, for instance. So Hindus in Sri Lanka would not be able to go to India. So there are some very interesting things that are happening and will continue to happen moving forward. So it's very irrational to assume that you can persecute a community and not expect backlash. It's just irrational. And if it's a territorialized community, the backlash very definitely will follow because that group will have its own sense of history tying them to the land. And they're going to inevitably come to the conclusion that we're going to be better off with our own country, right? And so this is what happened in Sri Lanka. And after the civil war, this is basically what a major commission came to conclude, that the root cause of Sri Lanka's civil war was because the government failed to address the genuine concerns of the Tamil minority. Not only did it fail to address the genuine concerns, the government contributed to the persecution of the Tamil minority. And so there were different ways in which they did that. They made the dominant community's language the only official language. They forced Tamil civil servants to learn the dominant community's language in order to get promoted. They stationed civil servants who didn't speak the Tamil language in Tamil areas. They stopped hiring Tamils into government service. Tamil students were required to score high to get into the university system. This didn't last a whole long period, but it was bad enough for a number of for hundreds of students when it happened. There were quota systems that were introduced to increase the number of Sinhalese students getting into the university system. The government stopped developing Tamil areas, even using foreign aid that was allocated to these areas and channeling it elsewhere. The colonization, taking Sinhalese from areas and from other areas of the country and sending them, providing them incentives to settle in minority areas, thereby changing the demographics, and then a number of other things. Okay, and so this is basically then what led to the civil war. And the Sri Lankan civil war was a very bloody affair. It lasted 26 years, killed probably 100,000 people, easily 100,000 people, displaced tens of thousands more. I have relatives who are victims of the Sri Lankan civil war, and people have been shot by the military, people whose houses were burned. And so what this also did from a democracy standpoint is that it created this narrative of exceptionalism, and there's a fascinating literature dealing with exceptionalism, dealing with Israel, dealing even with the US. It's this idea that during times of crises, the state can resort to extrajudicial and extra-constitutional practices because you're dealing with a crisis. So this happened with the Patriot Act, for instance, and that's the example that gets used when people talk about the U.S. after 9/11. Okay, I mean, world's largest terrorist attack, 3,000 people dying in multiple sites. They could have done anything, and so they went, and passed this Patriot Act, which many, in hindsight, came to consider a mistake. The same is true with violence in India and Sri Lanka, because the state makes the argument that it is facing an existential crisis. And if you're facing an existential crisis, you have to do whatever you can to maintain the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And so it exacerbates corruption. It allows, the state authorities, especially the army and police, to operate with impunity. And it also reinforces this ideology rooted in majority domination and minority subordination. Okay? So this was the separate state that they tried to create. That came to an end in May 2009, when this is a photo that I took that appeared in the New York Times front page. And the reason I kind of use this photo is, if you look at what's in the hands of the soldiers, they're cameras. They're not iPhones, because Sri Lanka did not have iPhones in 2009. The iPhone, I think, came into being around 2007. But these cameras documented all sorts of atrocities that were committed, and it's some of this footage that now is being used by human rights organizations, the UN, when it comes to accusations against the Sri Lankan armed forces about war crimes. Okay. So post-civil war, there's been we've seen some Islamophobia being weaponized in Sri Lanka. There's always been kind of an anti-Muslim sentiment in the country, so that was masked during the civil war, but that has come to the fore since the civil war. I can say more about that during question and answer time if you have questions, because we're running out of time. And there are a number of reasons that have contributed to the Islamophobia. There are cultural issues, there are economic issues, political issues. The Islamophobia, the anti-Muslim sentiment trending globally. And I can say more about this. This is something that also applies to India. The sense that basically it has to do, from a cultural standpoint, what it has to do is this kind of Wahhabi Salafi influence, kind of spreading into South Asia, where South Asian Islam is different. It's not the austere Islam that you see in the Middle East, and you're seeing some of those practices seeping into South Asian society, which Hindus in India, Buddhists in Sri Lanka find threatening, because it's changing the cultural landscape in terms of its influence. Now, let me quickly say that I don't want to end on a negative note. Okay, when you read the news about India, you're basically reading the news at the national level. It's Modi, the BJP. Okay. India still remains a very strong democracy for all these reasons that I'm not Sri Lanka in this case. Okay, and so people value democracy. Sri Lankans have been voting since 1931. Britain got universal suffrage in 1928. Sri Lanka was still a colony, and that's why it's considered Asia's oldest democracy. People have been voting since 1931. And they take the vote very, very seriously. And there have been elections when it looked like some tyrant would stay in power, and he was overthrown through the ballot. Okay, and so we shouldn't lose faith in people's ability to use the ballot to change regimes. People vote in high numbers. I mean, Sri Lankan presidential elections, 80% turnout. Shame on you, America. I mean, we can't even get 50% of the polls during, a presidential election. Maybe just over 50. You're lucky if you get 30% during, congressional election. So, vibrant civil society, taking the right to protest very seriously, driving out a president. Last year, if you kept up with the news, the protest movement forced the president to flee. Okay, and before that, his brother, the prime minister. Same with India. It's an electoral democracy, many problems, but it's a consolidated democracy. There is nobody in India who would say we're going to not hold elections. The only person who did that for 2 years was Indira Gandhi, and the moment she had an election, she lost. Okay, and so voting mainly free and fair. You also have to remember that at the sub-national level is where a lot of the action takes place, at the state level. And there are hundreds of political parties, between 350 to 400 political parties in India. We just hear Congress and the BJP, that's it. But there are so many dominant regional parties, and this is where the action is. Okay, and the country itself is, comprises of so many distinct regions. You try to run it as an autocracy, and you probably see, a dozen separatist movements overnight. So the only way to run this country is most likely through democracy, not by being some Putin. And that's something Modi knows, I think. So I don't think, we should lament the fact that democracy in both these countries has kind of, it's been backsliding. But I don't think at all that we need to lose hope, because I think democracy operates in a pretty vibrant fashion, notwithstanding the kind of nefarious influence religious nationalism plays. So let me stop there.
That's great, Neil. Thank you so much. Let's see. Maybe I'll stand over here for just a minute so that people online can see us. So we have lots of people in the room and probably also some online. We have some time for questions. So I'll get us started with one maybe, and then I'll get out of the way. But everybody else can be thinking. And online, we'll keep an eye on the chat, so you can feel free to chat in questions as well. And we'll keep an eye on that. Maybe you could start out by talking a little bit about, you spend part of your time sort of with policy audiences or non-governmental organizations who think about strengthening democracy in these countries. Modi had a very high-profile visit to the U.S. this past summer. The U.S. under the Biden administration has talked about wanting to sort of strengthen democracy in the face of sort of backsliding. But you also talked about the anti-colonial dynamics behind religious nationalism in these countries and the kind of anti-liberal side of them, anti-civil society. So how should policymakers in the U.S. strike that balance of kind of taking steps that can strengthen these democracies without falling into the trap of kind of anti-colonial rhetoric or being seen as sort of actually inadvertently strengthening the hands of some of these groups domestically?
So the anti-colonial rhetoric operates as a weapon. It's a very convenient weapon. And it's only used when these countries are criticized, right? Especially human rights terms. But strengthening democracy is something that, Western countries are committed to doing. But the Modi government also knows that it can get away with a lot. That it can pursue policies that undermine democracy, that undermine human rights. Because ultimately, we are in a situation now where the United States and its allies care more about the Indo-Pacific. And of course, China is the one thing that they're all focused on. And so what we're seeing, I think, is this realization on the part of Indian elites associated with the BJP that the United States and others, if they care about India's support in the Indo-Pacific, will have no choice but to look the other way. I mean, of course, they're going to make their comments. Of course, people in Congress who care about things like human rights will speak out, and you can't stop them from speaking out. They know that. Hearings will be held. When Modi came and talked to Congress, I think he's only the second person to have addressed Congress. Not the second person, I think he's the third person. Winston Churchill did it, I think, to have addressed Congress twice. So he had the chance to talk to the whole Congress twice. But there were a number of people, maybe half a dozen people, some of them of Indian origin, who boycotted the speech because of democratic backsliding and because of what's happening in Kashmir. but so it's challenging. It's challenging because there are enough people in the U.S. Congress and a lot of staffers on the Hill, for instance. They care about democracy and human rights, and I think that the trick here may be to put the pressure in private, because when you publicize criticism, uh, they South Asians tend to have a very thin skin, and they don't like being upbraided publicly. And so, striking that balance where you forcefully communicate, you know, what you want to see happen, or what your preferences are, or why it's important for India to kind of, hew to a more pluralist, a position when it comes to its minorities. Doing that in private as opposed to kind of trying to vilify them in public. The moment you do that, they use the anti-colonial rhetoric. But it's not an easy situation, and in some ways, I feel it's a little disappointing that the upper hand is with the elements in India who actually, can pursue an ideology at the expense of democracy, with the rest of the world having to think 10 times before they kind of criticize.
Maybe you could introduce yourself also.
My name is Scott Frankie. I teach in the humanities department. I teach religious studies, focus on Buddhism mostly. I have a question concerning Punya Bhumis and its sort of domain. Is it, in terms of the Hindu nationalists, when they think of the Holy Land, is it bounded by the current boundaries of the Republic of India, or does it expand to territories controlled by the British, for example, to Burma? What is the sort of relationship between this notion of a holy land and contemporary political boundaries?
It may depend on the group. So recently, there was a map of India that appeared at some forum or function. I don't think it was the G20 because India hosted the G20. I'm trying to think where this map appeared. And the map depicted India as constituting what is now Pakistan. I think included Nepal as well, and Bangladesh. It may have also included Afghanistan. I'm forgetting some of the details, but it did create a stir in these other countries as to why are you depicting India on a map by incorporating our countries, and so that concern was definitely communicated at various levels. Some just, at least in public, brushed it off. So this idea of a greater India, I think, is inextricably connected to Hinduism. And it's this sense that the Muslims of the subcontinent, if you go way back in time, their ancestors were Hindus who converted. Okay, the Christians were originally Hindus who converted. The subcontinent was a Hindu entity that had these others, come in. So I think the hardcore Hindutvasis are not uncomfortable at all thinking of, Hinduism being a religion that ought to dominate, what historically was considered, India. And that may vary among some others. It's also not practical and realistic. But again, when it comes to ideology, anything goes. Yes.
Well, thank you for speaking with us today, Dr. DeVotta. Really appreciate you taking the time. My name's Tristan. I'm a student here in the Policy Department and have the fortunate opportunity to do research with CAD as well. So really happy to have you here today. I'm curious, we hear so much about the BJP and contemporary Indian politics. Could you maybe give us a brief assessment of the state of the opposition both domestically in India, but then maybe touch on some of the attitudes within the Indian diaspora here in the United States. It's clear that Modi's very popular. I was in DC during the state visit, saw the huge turnout there. Is there criticism here in the United States or domestically in India? If you could just touch on that.
So it's a very good question, touching on a number of issues. So Congress is not what it used to be, and it's just lacking in leadership. So the leader of the Congress party right now, or at least at an operational level, is Rahul Gandhi, who is no match for Modi. It's also questionable what Rahul Gandhi's commitment is, basically, to reinvigorating the party and challenging the BJP, which has an incredible machinery. They got the money, they've got the support of the RSS, which has thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of cadre. And they've got the business interests that are behind them. The BJP has indeed news organizations that are behind them and that they have co-opted. And so you really need a collective effort. Basically, Congress would have to ally with a lot of the regional parties, which they've started to do. So this new alliance is, the acronym is India. And so depending on how many parties join this India alliance, it could challenge Modi, at the next election. And so I think we were having this conversation this morning. Modi himself is very popular. I mean, he's kind of like, I think of him as a kind of a Teflon prime minister, term that was used for Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, nothing seemed to stick, no matter how much you attack Reagan, and no matter how much you attack Modi. And no matter how many things he's done that have come across as being somewhat stupid. I mean, I don't have time to go into it, but demonetization and the curfew that was imposed, within like 3 hours, everybody had to stay home in a country where millions and millions of people are migrants in big cities. And when COVID hit, people died walking back to their villages, over days. And so nothing has affected him. His popularity right now is about 65%, I think, based on the more recent poll. And then your question had to do with, so Congress really needs to get its game, rev up its game, and it can't do it on its own. It has to join forces with a lot of these regional parties. And there are themes that they can touch on, I think, at the next election, which I don't have time to elaborate on, but I'm happy to talk with you after class about that. Some of the strategies that can be pursued to try to put the BJP on the back foot, right? But what's interesting with the US is, while Modi has enormous support among the Indian community, I think we're hearing the loudest voices, whereas there's maybe even a silent majority that is afraid to speak ill of Modi or don't seem like they have the need to do it. So this is a conversation that we had at dinner last night. I mean, there are, for instance, many from the southern part of India, a lot of IT engineers and doctors and others, and you don't see them for the most part at the forefront rooting for Modi in the US. I mean, the loudest voices tend to be Gujaratis, where Modi is from. They tend to be North Indians, but not so much people from the South. And so, does he have enormous support here? There are reasons for that support. They like a strong leader. Modi projects a very strong image. He certainly provides India a very prominent position on the world stage. They like to see their prime minister hobnobbing with Biden and being featured at a state dinner and speaking. So for all those reasons, there is kind of a nationalism that is also involved in supporting Modi to the extent that they do. But I think there are more people perhaps in this country and throughout the West who are of Indian origin who have concerns about Modi. And one clue is that the Indian American community votes disproportionately for Democrats. I think close to 70% of Indian Americans, don't quote me on that figure, but something in the mid 60s or 70s, voted for Joe Biden. And than for Donald Trump. And it had nothing to do with Trump. This is consistent with the way they have voted, since the 90s when the numbers really went up. And so they tend to be fairly progressive and liberal when it comes to American politics, and yet you tend to see kind of a pro-Hindutva attitude and mindset when it comes to Indian politics.
Maybe I'll take a quick look in the chat just in case we have a question that has come through here. No, looks like whoa. Looks like we're okay there. So, is there a last question in the room that we can wrap up? Yeah.
Well, can you address the Canadian, I'm Tricia Gray, faculty in political science. Can you address this Canada incident? I mean, is this going to become, this is a weird, right? It's like news of the weird, and then the U.S. response or lack thereof to it. What's your take on that?
Right. So I don't know if you saw the news this morning, but apparently the FBI had talked to 2 or 3 Sikhs in the US, alerting them that they could be endangered, and so they didn't tell them exactly what to expect, but these guys now have a sense as to what they should have expected. So this was something that has not only happened in Canada, maybe they were even thinking of dealing with some of the Sikh leaders in the US. So would the Canadian incident hurt Modi? Probably not. Okay. If anything, it may help him. Okay, it's going to help him as this strong leader who does not tolerate threats against India. Remember, elections coming up. Okay, within the BJP, there's been this within the Hindu right. I shouldn't say BJP. There's been this discourse on the side about why can't India operate like Israel? That's, when people threaten Israel, it doesn't matter where they live. Israel goes after them. Well, I mean, Israel goes after people living in some specific countries like say, Iran, and it can get away with it. It doesn't target people for assassination in the US or elsewhere. And where this gets complicated for India is that this story will likely not go away because the Canadians now will have to deal with this. There'll be pressure on the part of the Sikh community in Canada. So the Sikh community is about 800,000 people in Canada. Now that may sound like a little, but Canada's population is smaller than California's population. Okay, so the Sikhs, and there's also quite a few Sikhs who are leaders in the main Canadian parties, including Trudeau's party. And so this issue will not go away. There will be investigations, so the issue will be in the spotlight. It puts pressure on the US and others because they are an ally of Canada. So the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK are part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network. They're part of NATO, okay? And so they are duty bound to come to each other's aid, especially when it has to do with this kind of extraterritorial assassination. I think the Canadians are disappointed because on the one hand, these countries are saying, we are with you, we care about this, this is unacceptable, but they are not then turning around and putting pressure on more people. And again, it comes back to Indo-Pacific security and China. So it'll be interesting to see how this. I was, by the way, 2 weeks ago, I was in Surrey, in just outside Vancouver. And so there was quite a bit of chit chat among the Sikh community. There's a huge community in Surrey, especially. But about 1.4 million people of Indian origin in Canada, 800,000 Sikhs, the largest grouping of Sikhs in the world outside the Punjab in India. So it's an influential community and very well to do as well for the most part. It'll be interesting to see.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you for your questions and participation. Thanks to everyone for joining online, and most especially, thank you, Neil, for joining us here. We have some ceremonial things for the road here to remind you of your time in Louisville, water bottle, tote bag, and most importantly, a very good pen. Right? It's the most important thing for me.
Yeah, but I think there's some Kentucky bourbon in it.
That's right. That's right. You can't take it on the